Perera.
Mr. Speaker, sir, the Carbon Pricing Amendment Bill makes changes to our carbon pricing regime, including taking the major step of hiking the carbon price. As we debate this bill, I'm proud that our Singapore representatives and youth environment activists are flying our flag in Egypt at the UN Climate Change Conference, or COP27. And their participation reminds us of what is at stake here, why this climate change fight is critical, not only for the world, but for Singapore's national interests. And on that note, I'd just like to say that I'm sure many members of the House would agree that all of us owe a profound debt of gratitude to our Singaporean environmental activists who have helped to galvanize public opinion, move the needle, and generate very useful ideas for policy debates. So the Workers' Party supported the original carbon pricing bill, and we support the thrust of this amendment bill as well, as will be reiterated by my Workers' Party colleagues who will speak on the bill later. In the past, Workers' Party MPs have spoken about how there is scope to raise the carbon tax when comparing Singapore with international benchmarks. These are moves in the right direction for Singapore. Why is that so? What is at stake here? There is no greater challenge facing humanity than that of climate change. Rising temperatures triggered by growing greenhouse gas emissions, GHGs, in the atmosphere will lead to freakish weather patterns, rising sea levels, rising incidence of heat-related illness, the loss of biodiversity, and many other huge, dangerous, perhaps irreversible challenges for Singaporeans and for people around the world. We must avert what is known in economics as the tragedy of the commons, which in this context means the problem created when individual countries pursue their national interests in an uncoordinated fashion at the expense of the global environment, leading to disastrous effects applicable to all countries. The uniqueness and seriousness of the challenge we face here calls on us to show national resolve and unity across the political spectrum. If nations do their part, there's every reason to believe that the world can contain the danger posed by climate change. We should remember how nations came together in 1987 to bring into being the Montreal Protocol that succeeded in protecting the ozone layer. That precedent should give us hope that we can avert or at least substantially mitigate disaster at the edge of the precipice. Most mainstream economists accept that carbon pricing is probably the most sound and effective approach to controlling emissions of GHGs. Jennifer Morris, research scientist at MIT, puts it this way, and I quote, "Rather than regulating exactly where and how emissions should be reduced, carbon pricing gives markets the flexibility to find the cheapest ways to lower emissions," unquote. The European Union, Japan, China, California, and a few US states already use carbon pricing. A carbon price, by imposing a tax on GHG emitters, large GHG emitters, can potentially result in part of that tax burden being passed on to consumers in the form of higher prices. But such inflationary pressures need to be mitigated by two means. Firstly, good competition policy, which by optimizing competition in key industries tends to reduce the pass-through effect of the tax to end consumers vis-a-vis what it might have been. And secondly, social policies that cushion the effects of price rises on the most vulnerable segments of the population and thus help to enhance access to opportunity, social mobility, and the perception of fairness across all our social groups. This is important not only because we desire social justice, but also because climate change mitigation measures need to be designed to ensure the broadest possible public support so that the country will continue to back such measures through thick and thin and across political cycles. While we support the thrust of this bill, the Workers' Party has some amendments to suggest. Our amendments, while accepting the principle that the government can create and should create allowances to reduce the carbon tax paid in specific cases, seek to limit the scope and extent of allowances and to increase transparency and accountability, so as to ensure that the carbon pricing regime is seen to be fair, clear, and uniformly applicable to all, which enhances public buy-in, while at the same time making sure that it is a sufficiently robust nudge to businesses to find the best ways to reduce emissions. We do agree that allowances are needed for nationally strategic projects that are important for job creation and job defense, as well as to hedge against needless carbon leakage of large emissions-intensive, make sure I get this right, emissions-intensive trade-exposed or EITE facilities. But we believe that the balance point can be struck a little differently between promoting emissions reduction and ensuring robust support for business using economic incentivization. The Workers' Party's proposed amendments to this bill have been filed by my parliamentary colleague, Sengkang MP Ms. He Ting Ru, and myself. They stand the order paper supplement. In our speeches, we shall explain these amendments in detail and address possible objections. Mr. Speaker, sir, many Singaporeans are conscious of the threat posed by climate change to Singapore and the world. Many Singaporeans want our climate change policies to show ambition and seriousness. This is backed up by the recently released results from an online public consultation exercise run by the National Climate Change Secretariat, or NCCS, Of the 490 responses, 94% of respondents were willing to withstand trade-offs and inconveniences to achieve enhanced climate targets. Some of the suggestions from respondents, such as pivoting away from emissions-intensive industries and doing more to electrify our commercial fleets and vehicle population, have been subjects taken up by Workers' Party MPs in this House in the past, including Hougang MP Mr. Dennis Tan and Sengkang MP Mr. Louis Chua, for example. Before leaving this topic, it should be said that the respondents for this consultation contain a disproportionate percentage of younger people. Mr. Speaker, sir, beyond noting how public opinion is shifting, we should also note that being green need not be the enemy of economic growth. We must generate good jobs from cleaner and greener economic activities. In fact, most of the large multinational companies or MNCs in pollutive industries themselves, seeing the writing on the wall, are trying to show that they are transitioning towards greener practices, like refining biofuels rather than crude oil, or using carbon capture and sequestration technology, for example. Our challenge going forward is to find ways to promote a serious pursuit of ambitious climate goals with the pursuit of economic ones in tandem, not to counterpose the one to the other. Mr. Speaker, sir, I would now like to move on to explain the amendments standing in my name on the Parliamentary Order Paper Supplement for today, starting with the amendments which deal with allowances awarded under the carbon pricing regime. So the new provisions in this bill on the face of it introduce allowances that go against the fair, uniform and transparent price signal of the no-exemption carbon tax on large emitters, which ministers have previously argued is important for carbon tax to be effective. For example, in 2021, the government said in this House that, quote, our carbon tax framework has been tailored to our context, putting in place a fair, uniform and transparent price signal to incentivize emissions reductions, unquote. Having said that, the Workers' Party accepts the case for government allowances vis-à-vis the carbon tax paid by specific entities in principle. Allowances may be justified on two grounds. Firstly, that of attracting or retaining projects of a strategic nature where such projects are nationally important for job creation, job defense, or the dynamism of our economy, as well as to manage the extent of carbon leakage whereby some firms in EITE sectors, I pronounced that quite well, I think, in EITE sectors may transfer investments to countries with less green policies or with no carbon tax. The first rationale also applies to economic incentives awarded by agencies like the EDB and Enterprise Singapore, for example. Secondly, that of creating more of a runway for large entities whose products and prices affect many households to transition to a lower carbon-emitting business model in cases where that is justified. On this note, I would like to ask the government to expand on the considerations that will come into play in awarding allowances in more detail, a topic treated briefly in Section 20D of the bill. However, when we consider the question of allowances, there is a difference between carbon tax allowances and general economic incentives. Economic incentives provide benefits that not all firms enjoy. Carbon tax allowances, on the other hand, mean that all large emitters have to pay the carbon tax, but some large emitters have to pay less when awarded an allowance. There is a strong case to circumscribe the carbon tax allowances awarded in terms of extent as well as in terms of time. This is for two reasons. First, this is so as to demonstrate our ambition and our seriousness in the face of such a major challenge as climate change, to demonstrate the political will to keep allowances to the bare minimum so as to generate a strong nudge on business. Secondly, this is so as to foster confidence among companies themselves that the carbon tax regime and indeed our entire business environment is fair and transparent. This is necessary as the carbon tax is a significant burden applicable to firms and also the wider public. Imposing this burden comes with the responsibility to ensure that the public and business communities see that the burden will be imposed fairly and exceptions made on a very limited, transparent basis with strong reasons given, as opposed to a perception that allowances are awarded to companies close to any future government for one reason or another. For example, only then will we obtain the wider buy-in to the carbon tax regime from citizens and the business community that we need. Hence, we have tabled amendments to the broad powers given to the Minister to pick and choose taxable facilities to award non-time limited allowances to. Creating a more limited allowance regime sends a stronger signal about how we intend to approach the carbon tax and ensures that no government of the day can prop up any large emitter in perpetuity. Our amendment number 3, and at this point, Mr. Speaker, sir, perhaps I should add that before these amendments, both mine and Ms. Hertingru's can be voted on at the committee stage later. I understand that we need the President's recommendation, as these are tax-related and the fiscal implications, and I'm not aware if that recommendation is forthcoming at this point, but I shall continue to make the arguments for these amendments as
You can talk about it. We will address it at the committee stage.
Okay. Our amendment number 3 in the order paper tackles this problem of having non-time limited allowances that are not really as circumscribed in scope as they could be. Tackles this problem by limiting the number of times a taxable facility can receive allowances. Assuming businesses are able to get allowances when they ask for it, our amendment would mean, to take an example, that a facility can obtain allowances in the following years, 2024, 2025, and if still deemed necessary, after a gap, 2029 and 2030, with 2026, 27, and 28 being no allowance years. This still leaves a substantial runway for companies to transform to low-emission processes and sources from now until 2026, and leeway for the government to apply an allowance in 2029 for particularly large and strategic projects, if deemed necessary. And I would note at this point that large and strategic projects, facilities, factories, and so on, typically have break-even periods and are invested and set up based on projections that go forward far into the future, sometimes 10 years, sometimes 20 years. So our amendment number 10 limits the extent of allowances to a maximum of 33% of the carbon tax assessed to be payable, and not 50% as the wording of the current bill reads to our understanding. In other words, our amendment sets up a cap of 33% because the tax charge must not be less than double the awarded allowance. We believe that lowering the allowance cap makes for a stronger nudge for large emitters to move towards greener business models faster. We believe that our amendment makes for a better balance point between the competing objectives on the table here. Having said that, I would like to point out that for projects and companies that are deemed to be nationally strategic or where their business affects the lives of many Singaporeans, and they may need more time to transition to greener processes, or we may want to cushion the effect on the wider public, especially vulnerable groups, the government still has other tools that can be used to address that situation, namely, first of all, other economic incentives that can be applied under other acts, and secondly, fiscal tools to implement some degree of income redistribution and cushion the effect of higher prices on more vulnerable groups in a targeted fashion. So next, I would like to move on to speak on the amendments which have the effect of creating a public registry of the government's allowance awards. Our amendments ensure and I quote, ensure the award is listed in a registry that is provided free of charge and easily accessible to the public through electronic means, specifying, etc., etc., unquote. The information which is required to be included in this public registry that we are proposing, in addition to that referring to the number of emissions years the allowance is applicable to and the methodology for calculating this, include C, and I quote here again, C, the registered person of the taxable facility who has received allowances, and D, the minister's reasons for deciding to award the allowances, unquote. The current version of the bill does not require the minister to disclose allowances or any details on them. Some members of the public raised this issue during consultations, some civil society groups as well, and in the ministry's public response after the carbon tax consultation, the ministry cited commercial sensitivity concerns. The government has also said it is, quote, not productive or correct, unquote, to put companies who pay carbon tax under public scrutiny. It could be argued that such awards should remain confidential because their disclosure could give the competitors of the company receiving the award some information that might give them a competitive advantage in various actions they choose to undertake, or which might lead to that company being placed in an unfavorable position when negotiating with stakeholders such as customers and partners who may ask for better terms. It could also be argued that being publicly known as a recipient of such an award may subject the recipient and their employees to some degree of public opprobrium due to the perception of being on the receiving end of some unfair advantage of some kind. Or it could be argued that disclosure of awards may hinder the government in applying different kinds of awards to different companies in consideration of what is needed to close the deal in each case, therefore making the government operate at a disadvantage in calibrating the award in each case to the bare minimum necessary to serve the national interest. There could be other considerations here along similar lines. Companies receiving government incentives under laws like the Economic Expansion Incentives Act are currently not disclosed, nor, of course, are the amount of the incentives disclosed. Why then do we call for the carbon tax awards to be disclosed? Are we calling for the same disclosure for other types of economic incentives? Sir, we are not. In fact, there are significant differences between carbon tax allowance awards and more general economic incentives for investment. A carbon tax allowance is a reduction in tax applied to one entity versus all similar entities which have to pay that tax. Hence, it is a lessening of a burden applied to all in the case of one. An economic incentive, on the other hand, gives additional benefits to one company that all do not receive. The difference between the two scenarios is that in the first case, a new tax being imposed means new cost to all. If one entity has a cost lessened, to obtain general buy-in for the tax among all companies and the public, a certain degree of transparency and public accountability is warranted for the new regime to be seen as fair. Moreover, given that the carbon tax imposes costs across the whole society and an allowance blunts the effect of that tax to some degree, there is a public interest in knowing who receives such awards to ensure accountability vis-à-vis the goals of the carbon tax. This helps ensure that any government of the day does not prop up certain companies for an unjustifiably long period of time or even in perpetuity for whatever reason. This ensures public support for a costly tax that is meant to be, in the words of the government spoken in this House in 2021, a, quote, fair, uniform and transparent price signal, unquote, that advances climate change goals, or to quote the government's words again in 2018, to create a carbon tax regime that, quote, will apply uniformly to all sectors without exemption. This will maintain a transparent, fair and consistent carbon price across the economy, unquote. On a more practical note, not ensuring that transparency is also not a foolproof means of keeping the award information secret. Such information often gets leaked and shared within the community of persons interested in such things by word of mouth and may breed speculation and undermine confidence in the business environment. Sometimes government incentive information needs to be disclosed to some degree in public filings in the company's home country. To address the competitive concerns and the concerns about government agencies having a legitimate interest in not revealing the amount of the award or the terms of the award given to specific companies in specific cases, our proposal for a public registry does not require information about the quantity of the award to be disclosed. I repeat, does not require information about the quantity of the award to be disclosed. So I trust I've explained why the Workers' Party is calling for more transparency in the case of carbon tax allowances, but not for an equal level of transparency when it comes to general economic incentives for inward investment. So amendment number 12 deletes the language of line 21 to 24 on page 14 of the bill, which allows the minister to determine, quote, in any other manner that the minister considers appropriate, unquote, ways to incentivize the continued reduction in GHG emissions of the taxable facility. We propose this deletion so as to eliminate a provision that might allow a minister to disregard the formula specified in the previous section for the maximum cap for an allowance. That formula should be taken more seriously. In short, we believe that deleting those lines reduces overly broad executive discretion and strikes a better balance point between legitimate executive discretion on the one hand and creating a transparent rules-based system on the other hand. In conclusion, sir, there are other amendments that are merely language edits that are consequential to the substantive amendments that are numbered in the order paper supplement as 3, 4, 7, and 10. I shall not explain them in detail, but we would be glad to take any questions on those. Another important set of our amendments will be explained later by Sengkang MP Ms. Herting Roo. So in conclusion, we support the thrust of the Carbon Pricing Amendment Bill before the House. We must avoid the tragedy of the commons as a country and as a species. However, we have proposed a number of amendments that we feel strengthen the thrust of the bill and make it better, and which will enhance wide public acceptance, as well as better align the provisions and effects of the bill with the climate change outcomes that we seek. So I beg to move the 12th amendment standing my name in today's order paper supplement. Thank you.
Mr. Leon Perera, I said that you address those in the committee stage. You don't move the amendments now. Noted.